Hello, everybody. We are back after about 8-9 months absence from the podcast, but it's back. It is back. This is episode 10 of the Mental Health Truth Podcast. I am your host, Marcus, but you can call me Truth. All right, we have a good one here today. Decided to start off strong, coming back. So the first topic, or the whole main idea of this episode, is going to be about bullying. So is it possible to stop bullying? So now, that's a really loaded question because there's many different aspects of bullying, right? So I decided to start off by looking at some articles, as we usually do, and see what their definition of bullying is. And we're also going to look at cyberbullying too, because that is typically another aspect of bullying. So without further ado, let's look at the definition of bullying. So we have this first article, so stopbullying.gov. So they say bullying is unwanted aggressive behavior among school-age children. Now that's something to make note of. School-age children. Just remember that. Okay. Unwanted aggressive behavior among school-age children that involves a real or perceived power imbalance. That's another important part, the perceived power imbalance. So remember that as well. So let's continue. The behavior is repeated or has the potential to be repeated over time. Both kids who are bullied and who bullied others may have serious lasting problems. In order to be considered bullying, the behavior must be aggressive and include an imbalance of power. So the description of that is kids who bully use their power, such as physical strength, access to embarrassing information, or popularity, to control or harm others. Power imbalances can change over time and in different situations, even if they involve the same people. Now, I want you to remember that last sentence. Power imbalances can change over time and in different situations, even if they involve the same people. All right. And then the other point they had was repetition. Bullying behaviors happen more than once or have the potential to happen more than once. Okay. So some of the examples they give. Bullying includes actions such as making threats, spreading rumors, attacking someone physically or verbally, and excluding someone from a group on purpose. Okay, so let's look at this piece by piece. So unwanted aggressive behavior among school-age children. So if you didn't know, I posted a question on my Instagram because I was thinking about this topic of bullying, and I wondered, is it only just because you hear about bullying all the time in schools, but you never hear about it when school's over? After you graduate, you don't really hear people use the word bullying anymore. It's just related to younger people. So I asked my followers, I said, does bullying only pertain to children up to young adulthood, or does it go beyond that? And 76% of people said that it goes beyond that. Only 24% saying it's only with children or young adults. So most people agree that it's beyond that. But this definition says among school-age children. So it's basically saying that it doesn't happen. It doesn't happen when you're older. It only happens when you're a children, which is interesting. How come it only pertains to school-age children the definition, but it doesn't pertain to anything else. Then the next part was the perceived power imbalance. So it says real or perceived. Now that the perception of a power imbalance you can't necessarily control. Two people may have the same power, but if you perceive you to have less power than somebody else, then it would be considered bullying if they used one of the actions that they made, and if it was repeated over and over again. So you don't necessarily know. It's based on the actual person that is quote unquote being bullied, which it's hard to really say because, that's something that you can't really measure. Like you could just say that you have a imbalance or this person's higher than you. But you can't really control that or like see if that's really true, right? And an example I would have would be, let's say if you have a jock, like your typical jock, and like a nerd or someone that does good in school, right? So if it's like a social event, the jock would have the quote unquote more power than the nerd, right? So the jock would have more power, and if he does one of those actions, let's say he spreads rumors about the nerd, and he does it repeatedly, right? So that would be a perceived power imbalance, right? But let's change that situation, and let's say if it was based on like academics and schoolwork. Now the nerd, since they're doing good at school, would have more power than the jock who doesn't really care about like academics. So now they have more power, and now the power imbalances are switched. So these power imbalances change all the time. Like they said, it can change over time and in different situations. So that means that it's possible for anyone to do it instead of the people we usually think would do it. Let's say someone's bigger than you, right? You wouldn't think the smaller person would do like bullying behaviors to the big person, but it can change over time, and there's many different variables. So I don't necessarily like that perceived part, or even just the power imbalance in general. And also just the school age children part, because there's more to that than just school aged, But that's why I wanted to ask, because that's all I ever heard was it happening in school. Because let's look at it. Let's compare the children aspect to like when you're an adult, right? So if we look at these actions, right? Let's look at the types of bullying, right? So it says there are 3 types of bullying: verbal bullying, social bullying, and physical bullying. So verbal bullying is saying or writing mean things. So it includes teasing, name calling, inappropriate sexual comments, taunting, threatening to cause harm. So now if we go back to the definition, it says unwanted and aggressive behavior. Now, teasing or name calling, that's not necessarily aggressive or taunting at all. Maybe threatening to cause harm and sexual comments would be aggressive. Like they don't necessarily, it's hard to define aggressive. You think of aggressive as physical bullying, right? But there's different aspects of aggressive behavior. It could be like an aggressive verbal comment, I guess. But you don't necessarily know the definition of aggressive behavior, because it depends on how that person took the words that you said. And that's a huge point on bullying in general, but I'll get to that later on after we cover all of this. So if we look at the verbal bullying part, right? All of the things that they mention. Now, adults they do the exact same thing, right? But they wouldn't necessarily say it's bullying. You would just say like, like name calling and teasing, they're all jokes, right? Usually like when you're older, you'll just say, oh, we're just joking around, we're just having fun. But usually when you're younger, you wouldn't necessarily say that. People say, oh, you went too far, or you're bullying this person. So it's the same action, but when you're older, you don't perceive it as bullying, but when you're younger, you perceive it as bullying. So can we really call this bullying? Like, can we say like it's difficult to define, because it all depends on how the person perceives what is happening to them. Like, someone can do all of these things in the verbal bullying column, but be okay with it. They could just think that it's jokes, and it wouldn't necessarily be bullying. The person could repeatedly do it. It can be unwanted or aggressive, but it's not necessarily, they don't see an issue with it. They're just having fun. So it all depends on how the person perceives what was said to them or what was done to them that would necessarily classify it as bullying. So then we go on social bullying. So social bullying, sometimes referred to as relational bullying, involves hurting someone's reputation or relationships. Social bullying includes leaving someone out on purpose, telling other children not to be friends with someone, spreading rumors about someone, and embarrassing someone in public. Now, I wanted to go back to the definition where they talked about repetition, right? So in order for it to be bullying, it has to be repeated over and over again. So let's say telling other children not to be friends with someone, right? Let's say like there's someone that and people are going to try to be friends with that someone. You're like, no, don't be friends with that person. That person's, they're boring, they're not fun, they're a loser, right? Let's say they say that. And then the people like agree with it, right? Let's just say, okay, you're right. That person's not that great to be with, so they don't be their friend, right? Now, that person could say that one time. So they said it, let's say this one person said it to 3 people. And then those 3 people tell 9 people. And then those 9 tell 27 other people. Now, you can't necessarily say that's repetition because of how it spreaded, just like a rumor. Now, if that person only said it one time, but it spread to, let's say, the whole school, and now other people are talking about it, but they didn't repeat it. So each person said it one time, and now no one wants to be friends with that one person. It wouldn't be repetition because you only said it one time. But it says this would be a form of social bullying, but can't necessarily say that because it doesn't meet the repetition guidelines, so to speak. Or even the imbalance of power, because how can you measure the imbalance of power if someone's just saying don't be friends with someone? That doesn't mean that other person has more power than you, because those people can easily like say, oh no, this person's actually a cool person, I'm gonna be friends with them. Doesn't mean that person's like such a higher power if people listen to them or not. So it doesn't necessarily meet what they're saying as the definition of bullying. And this would also fall into like adults as well, because like let's say you don't want to, so like leaving someone out on purpose. There's many different ways you could leave someone out, right? Let's say like someone's texting you and you decide just, I don't want to respond to them. I kind of just want to do my own thing. That would be considered as leaving them out on purpose, because you don't necessarily want to talk to them. So you decide to just like leave them to the side. And let's say you repeatedly do that. Would that be bullying, huh? Because it meets the guidelines of imbalance of power, apparently, since you do have the power of not responding to them and you're doing it repeatedly. So, and again, with this, they're using children again, instead of just people in general. All right, and last but not least is physical bullying. So everyone pretty much knows about this. Physical bullying involves hurting a person's body or possessions. Physical bullying includes hitting, kicking, pinching, spitting, tripping, pushing, taking or breaking someone's things, making mean or rude hand gestures. I don't know how that last one makes sense, but we'll go along with it. So, with this physical bullying, right? Now, I wanted to go back to the part of the adults when you compare children to adults. Now, usually when you're an adult and you see someone hitting someone, right? Pushing, you think it's a fight, unless if like they're getting jumped and multiple people are there, right? So it would just be considered a fight. Even when you're like a kid or a child, you would just think it's a fight. Everyone circles around, everyone's watching, thinking it's fun. And that's pretty much it. Now, the person that got beat up, they're going to perceive it as bullying. Whereas as a child, but as an adult, you'll just see it as a fight, right? The person that's on the floor, they lost the fight. That's essentially what it is. So you have the same situation on two different age groups, but they both perceive it as different. So older would just be, they just fought. Children would be like, oh, this person's bullying me because they keep hitting me and whatnot. So now this one would meet, quote unquote, the definition for the imbalance of power, even though you could obviously hit someone back, you could kick someone back, you could like basically do the same things to the other person. So in a sense, it wouldn't meet the definition because there wouldn't be an imbalance of power here. The person could repeatedly do it again, right? But then you come back and then like you fight them or whatever. And then repetition would make sense because someone would repeatedly do that. So that's pretty much just the bullying aspect of this. So yeah, I don't agree with this definition, especially the power imbalance, the aggressive behavior, because you can't necessarily measure aggression. Well, you can. There's like definitions. Like if you asked what's aggression, you could come up with many different answers. But you think of like violence and like just lashing out on somebody as aggression. And then the power imbalance, you can't, since they use the word perceived or even real, like there's not necessarily a power imbalance. It depends on the environment that you're in. Like I said with the jock and the nerd example, if it's an academic environment, the nerd's going to have more power, more people are going to come to them like, oh, can you help me or whatever with work? So that person's going to have more quote unquote power in that situation. But if it's like a social situation, the jock would have more power because he's more popular, people like want to hang out with him, etc. So it all based on your perception, right? Because let's say someone's bigger than you, but you don't necessarily perceive it as like a power imbalance. You just see that person is equal to you. But you can also have the mindset of, I'm just not as good as that person that's messing with me, right? So it's all based on like your perception on what happens, who the person is, and the words that may or may not have been said. So how can you really stop it if it's mainly based on what you think about it. And I wanted to go back to the other question that I said on Instagram. It was about verbal bullying. So it was, do you think verbal bullying is more than just jokes? And 95% of people said it was more than just jokes. But so we went over verbal bullying, like teasing, name calling, or whatever. Now, when you're an adult, people do that all the time. Like I said before, friends will like say jokes to others, and it's just fun, right? You don't take it too seriously. You don't take it to heart. So technically, it would be verbal bullying, right? Since they're doing it repeatedly. But the person doesn't perceive it as bullying. They just perceive it as a joke. Now, if someone took that joke personally or felt attacked or hurt by it, then it would be bullying. So how can you really define it if it depends on how you perceive it? So what would have to be done, let's say if you wanted to stop it, right? You would have to, in my opinion, you can't necessarily stop it. It's not necessarily something you can do to stop someone else from saying harmful things to you or like spreading rumors to you. It's everything out of your control. Like, how can you stop someone from, let's say, spreading rumors about someone? You could have all the punishments in the world, but you can't stop them from doing it. You can't just put some tape around their mouth and be like, okay, you can't speak. Like, because that would be force. You can't necessarily do that. So you can't necessarily make someone just not do it. It's up to them to do it. But what if we made it so if people did do this, the people that were receiving it doesn't perceive it as hurtful or negative and feel bad about themselves? That's what we would have to do to quote unquote stop it. Because there's people that it happens to all of us. All these things, it's happened to all of us, yet a lot of us can just like move past it, like, oh, it doesn't really affect me, Maybe you've heard it all the time and you've gotten used to it. Or maybe like you truly don't believe the negative stuff that people say, so it doesn't affect you. That's what we would have to do for everybody. And since they're using school-age children, that's what we would have to do in schools as like an intervention or like a program, right? So essentially, like with bullying, right? The person is receiving so many negative things in their life. And in order to reverse that, we would have to put a lot of positive things into their life to balance it out. Because if they're just receiving so many negatives, and usually like, if you go to schools, like teachers just be like, they will like make the person that bullied them like, oh, go to the principal's office or you have detention. Like they will get like something like a punishment, right? Even though those things aren't necessarily punishment. So they'll receive a punishment, but how does that necessarily help the person that was being bullied? They still have that negative. You didn't take the words away. It didn't really do anything. You just help them avoid that person for the short period of time. And then once that person comes back, it's going to get even worse. So you see, it doesn't necessarily help them. And it in fact makes it kind of worse for the person. You're not like providing any positivity to the person that's bullied. You're just removing the bully out of the situation. So the person that's being bullied still sits with those negative words or whatever happened to them. And usually what we do as humans, we tend to think about the negative way more than the positive. So if we hear something negative, let's just say like someone says you're a loser, right? Then you're going to start thinking about it. It's going to go in your head, I'm a loser, I'm a loser, I'm a loser. And then they're going to constantly think about it, and then they're going to eventually start to believe it. Not necessarily like you could say it one time, but they can say it over and over and over in their head because they've never heard anything positive. They've only heard that one negative thing, and they've gravitated to that negative thing. So now they believe it. Let's say someone says something else now. Like, let's just say you're ugly. So now that's the only thing that person's heard. And now they're going to think about it. Okay, loser and then ugly. Now they're going to start to believe it. And then more and more things pile up. And it just becomes way worse. And that's usually what happens with bullying, right? The person receives so much negativity, but they don't necessarily receive positive. Like, for example, let's say the loser and ugly, someone called them that. So that's two negatives. Let's say a friend, right, comes in to intervene. Like, hey, stop messing with this person, right? Let's say the bully leaves. Do those two negative things get eliminated? No. And are there any positives that counteract these two negatives? No. So this person still has those two negatives, even though someone helped them, right? So if someone helped them, they may feel good about that. We'll say that's a positive. They have someone for support, right? That's still one positive and two negatives. Now we tend to disregard the positives. So we may say, oh, that person just helped us during that moment. They're not going to be there every single time this happens. So what happens? They remove that positive themselves. They don't believe it. It was just a one-time thing. But these two negatives, they're going to keep forever because there's no necessarily positives that come in. That's usually what happens when you are in that cycle of negative self-talk. So let's say if we do bring some positive words, right? Let's just say they are, attractive and then exciting, right? So now there's two on each side. Now the negative talk in your head, right? They already believe these two negatives. You don't necessarily need any evidence. Someone can just say it, and then you start to come up with evidence yourself. So now we need evidence of these two positive words. Someone can just say these positive things, but that doesn't mean that they'll truly believe it. So how do they get these two positives? Well, they would need examples. So the person can come up with examples. Do you remember this time such and such happened, and you made, let's say you made us laugh, right? So now they're starting to get evidence for these two positives being true. And you can also give them evidence on why those two negatives would be false. You could say maybe some people believe that these things are true, but deep down inside, these things are not true. You want the person to believe that these two things, these two positives are true and these two negatives aren't. They could say whatever negatives they want, but deep down inside, you know who you are. And you know what you provide, what you bring to the table. And just have them start believing in these positives, right? Just to build that resiliency. So whenever someone says a whole bunch of negativity, it doesn't necessarily affect them because they know themselves who they are, the characteristics and personality that they have. So it'll eventually come to a point where these two are removed. These two negatives are removed. They only believe the positive. Yes, these negatives don't necessarily go away forever. They still linger around sometimes, but it's when the person truly knows who they are to remove them, right? So generally everyone has a bunch of positives and a bunch of negatives, right? If we had all positives, then we would all be like perfect human beings. But we're not like that. It's just we tend to focus more on the negative, and that's just based on survival and whatnot. Like if you focused on the positive, you wouldn't prepare yourself for the negative that comes. So it shifted towards the negative, and in order to counteract that, we have to build more positivity in people. So that's how you would necessarily, quote unquote, stop it. You can't necessarily stop people from making those actions, no matter what consequences you give them. You just have to build everybody up to the point where when these things happen, it doesn't necessarily affect them as much. So that's typically how my definition of how you would stop it would be. But so that was the bullying aspect. Let's look at the cyberbullying aspect. So this one I'd probably agree more. So it says cyberbullying is bullying that takes place over digital devices like cell phones, computers, and tablets. It can occur through messaging, text, apps, social media forums, or gaming. So it includes sending, posting, or sharing negative, harmful, false, or mean content about someone else. It can include sharing personal or private information about someone else, causing embarrassment or humiliation. So now let's see. Let's look at the frequency of cyberbullying. So these two statistics that they have are all based on students. Again, there's nothing about adults. So it's basically just saying that adults don't really get affected by this. But it says only 15% for both statistics were being cyberbullied. So it's a low number, which is good. But what would I say is worse, cyberbullying or bullying? So I would say that's a tough one. But in my opinion, I would say cyberbullying would be worse because it's something that lasts 24/7. Either way, both ways make it so you perceive yourself negatively. So they both end up leading to the same result. It's just with cyberbullying, you're exposed to it 24/7. However, you do have the option to never see it just by getting off of social media, which is like a huge grasp that I have on social media. I talk about social media all the time. But it's like people don't want to get off of it. People try to. People are like, I'm getting off of social media, it's too much. But then like a week or two later, they're back on it. It's essentially addicting, and it serves as like a huge entertainment for people. So even if they're being treated badly, they're going to still go on it. They're just going to try their best to avoid it. And really avoiding things is not necessarily going to solve things. So yes, you can block people. You can like make your account private or whatnot, but that doesn't necessarily solve it. It just further avoids like what's really going on, right? And let's say if like you delete your account, right? Let's say you go to school. People are going to talk about and show you what they've been talking about negatively to you. So you can't necessarily avoid it. It's just going to keep coming back and back and back to you. And that made me want to talk about the have you ever seen the movie Cyberbully? I've watched it like 6-7 times, but the last time I watched it, I like was looking at it like heavily, trying to like critique it and see like what I agreed and what I disagreed. And I noticed a lot of the reviews that the movie had. The one major problem that they said in the movie was that the main character, she was being bullied online, but she never deleted her social media profile. And I would say that was a positive thing in the movie because it basically replicates what children actually go through. So like I said, if they're being bullied or whatnot, they don't want that to happen online, but they don't want to get off of it because they want to see what people are saying about them. They don't want to just go back to school with a completely open mind. They're like, people said these things about me, but I don't know what they said specifically. At least if you know what they said, you can kind of mentally prepare yourself to come in the next day. But if you just delete it, that doesn't mean it's going to be avoided. Everyone else has a phone. Everyone else has a device. They can easily just show you when you're at school. So it doesn't necessarily solve or get rid of anything. So I thought that was a positive point instead of a negative point. So that's basically all of cyberbullying. I have another article here. So bullying and cyberbullying. So it says, being bullied can leave you feeling helpless, humiliated, depressed, or even suicidal. But there are ways to protect yourself or your child at school and online and deal with a bully. So again, it's based on school. It's not based on adults. So it's basically saying only people in school get affected by this. But anyways, they have a definition. Bullying is repeated aggressive behavior that can be physical, verbal, or relational, in person or online. Bullies are often relentless, bullying over and over again for long periods of time. You may live in constant fear of where and when the bully will strike next, what they'll do, and how far they'll go. So this definition is very similar to the first one. So it has to be repeated, and it's aggressive behavior. So this one doesn't have the power imbalance. That's the only difference. This definition isn't necessarily better because, again, you can't put a definition on the aggressive behavior. So that's kind of a huge issue. So they have hitting, verbal, and relationship bullying. I like that they have includes refusing to talk to you. Now, if that's the case, then everyone has been relationship bullied in their life. Because there's many times where people refuse to talk to you. And they exclude you from groups or activities, making you do things you don't want to do. We've all had that happen. So I wouldn't necessarily say that would be bullying. It's just the person necessarily doesn't want to talk to you or doesn't necessarily want you a part of their life. And unfortunately, in this current day of age, people are too afraid to actually say that. They'd rather just kind of just ghost you or kind of just part ways, since everything's basically digital. And if they don't have to see you again, they'd rather just leave it at that instead of actually saying, hey, I just don't want to talk to you anymore. I think it's best if we part ways. But no one really wants to do that. But let's keep going. So basically, cyberbullying is pretty much the same as the one before. Comes in all shapes and sizes, can torment you 24 hours a day. So let's look at the effects. So it says you're made to feel hurt, angry, afraid, helpless, hopeless, isolated, ashamed, or even guilty. That the bullying is somehow your fault. You may even feel suicidal. So again, with most of these adjectives they give, so angry, afraid, helpless, hopeless, etc. it all goes back to how you perceive it. So there's many people that has this happening to them, but they don't necessarily perceive it as, they don't take it personal, basically. They don't take what was said to them personal. Like, they're okay. They know who they are. And that's basically the key here. They know who they are. So whatever words that don't fit or don't align with who they are, they're not going to accept it. So like, think of like a barrier right here. If like, let's say like some negative words come in, but you truly know yourself and you know who you are, that's not going to be able to enter. Now, if it was positive words that you truly believe that you are those things, they can go right over. But if it's anything negative, they're not going to believe it. Now, even if you do it over and over and over again, it may get to them, but not in the way that you think. It's not necessarily they believe those things. It's just they could be just annoyed from hearing it over and over again. It's like, can you stop saying those things? You know, it's annoying. I don't want to hear it. I'm not those things. So it's more being like annoyed from hearing it over and over again, instead of feeling like they're hopeless and starting to believe that these negative things are true. Next point, your physical health is likely to suffer, and you are at a greater risk of developing mental health problems such as depression, low self-esteem, anxiety, or adult onset PTSD. So now we get to the adult side. So those negative words can affect you negatively, and it can carry on to adult life, which there's always something in your childhood that negatively that affects you when you get older. So cyberbullying can happen anywhere, yes. Cyberbullying can be witnessed by potentially thousands of people, which is true, and a lot of us doesn't necessarily do anything because we either think that it's not necessarily a big deal, that person will be okay, or we believe that someone else will help them out. But there's a problem when everyone believes that someone else will help them out, and then it ends up being nobody. So, why am I being bullied? Let's see. Bullies tend to pick on people who are different or don't fit in with the mainstream. Now, I like the next sentence that they have, but before that, those people are typically better off at the end than like everything else. Like, the mainstream is essentially like, it's weird. It's like a lot of people fit in with the mainstream, so it doesn't necessarily make you stand out. You know, like if someone was different, right, you notice that person instantly, rather than other people that have like the same interest or whatnot. So those people are actually better off later on. But they, unfortunately, you know, like things happen to them while they're younger. While your individualism is something that you will celebrate later in life, it can seem like a curse when you're young and trying to fit in. Perhaps you dress or act differently, or maybe your race, religion, or sexual orientation sets you apart. Maybe simply that you're new to the school or neighborhood and haven't made friends yet. So other reasons why kids bully. 1, to make themselves popular or to gain attention. Honestly believe that's the main reason. Actually, no, that's not the main reason. Number 2, because they're jealous of you. That's a potential reason as well. They may see something that you have. So going back to the power imbalance. So the bully has less power than the person that's being bullied. But they perceive, the person that's being bullied perceives themselves as having less power. You see how that can be confusing? So both people, the bully and the person being bullied, perceives themselves as having less power. So they're both essentially is on an equal playing field. and then one messes with the other person, and that quote unquote creates the opposite power imbalance. So number 3, to look tough or feel powerful. Okay. Number 4, because they're being bullied themselves. And number 5, to escape their own problems. Now, I think the main reasons are the first and the fifth one. So popularity, gaining attention, and escaping their own problems. They say usually the person that bullies others have been bullied themselves. And they do that to kind of make themselves feel better, right? They've received so much negativity, and by bullying someone else, they get to bring out the negativity to that other person while boosting themselves up and adding on to those positivities, those positive words, phrases, or whatnot. So negativity and positivity. So let's see. How to deal with a bully. This should be interesting. So don't blame yourself. It is not your fault. No matter what a bully says or does, you should not be ashamed of who you are or what you feel. The bully is the person with the problem, not you. Now, to the person that's being bullied, that may help, but what about the bully? So you're saying the bully has the problem, but how is anybody helping that bully with the problem? You're just labeling that bully as someone that needs help. And they probably do, but not the way that you may think. But let's see. Try to view bullying from a different perspective. The bully is an unhappy, frustrated person who wants to have control over your feelings so that you feel as badly as they do. Don't give them the satisfaction. Now, if you heard that description, wouldn't you want to help the person wouldn't you want to help the bully instead of just creating that? See, going back to the power imbalance. So by viewing it this way, you're basically saying that you have more power than the bully since they're unhappy and frustrated, and you're in the good position and they're just trying to bring you down with them. So it still is a power imbalance. It's basically saying the bully has all these negative things going on, and you're not necessarily doing anything to help them out. Because if you help the bully out, let's say with whatever's going on, most likely they wouldn't bully you anymore because they're feeling good. They have positive things about them. Don't beat yourself up. Don't make a bullying incident worse by dwelling on it or reading cyberbullying messages over and over. Instead, delete any messages and focus on the positive experiences in your life. There are many wonderful things about you, so be proud of who you are. Now, this one I don't have problems with, besides the delete any messages. For example, if that was me, I'd want to keep all the proof that I have so that in case if it does get really bad, I can report it and get something done. You want to keep the proof instead of getting rid of the proof. And just because you keep the proof doesn't mean that you have to look over it all the time and dwell on it. You could just keep it. So if anything goes wrong, you have all this evidence to use against the person. And that person can't just say, oh no, that wasn't me. I wasn't doing it. It was just a joke, etc., etc. All right. Learn to manage stress. Finding healthy ways to relieve the stress generated by bullying can make you more resilient, so you won't feel overwhelmed by negative experiences. Exercise, meditation, positive self-talk, muscle relaxation, and breathing exercises are all good ways to cope with the stress of bullying. Okay, that's a fair point. Even though, so these things are about school-age children, yet they don't necessarily teach this in schools. Another issue there. Maybe that's why we typically use the term bullying with children and young adults and not with adults, because as you get older, you pretty much learn these things on your own and they don't affect you as much. But as you're a kid, you're not learning any of these things. So you're just getting overwhelmed and affected over and over again because these things aren't taught to you. But that's a topic for another time. Last but not least, spending time doing things you enjoy. The more you spend time with activities that bring you pleasure, sports, hobbies, hanging out with friends who don't participate in bullying, for example, the less significance bullying or cyberbullying will have on your life. I could see that, but doing activities is essentially avoiding. Well, I get it. I get it. That can make sense. I see what they're saying there. So let's see. See, here's the thing. So this one said, so how they said delete the messages, right? But on tips of dealing with cyberbullying, they have save the evidence. So exactly, you want to save the evidence, but you don't want to delete the messages. You want to save it. So, and then the last one was just I wanted to look up adult bullying. So, and this article even says that adult bullying occurs more than actual child bullying. But again, we don't necessarily perceive it as that, right? So an example they used was like the workplace. Let's say you have a supervisor that's controlling, right? You wouldn't necessarily say that's bullying. You just say like I have a very controlling and strict supervisor to go to. You wouldn't necessarily say, oh, this supervisor's bullying me, right? So it's just different words that we use, even though it has the same effect. So that is essentially it for the articles. So I wanted to end off with a few questions that I had. So a last minute like Q&A. So I wrote some questions about bullying and I was going to answer them. So the first question, what are some consequences of school bullying? Pretty much went over that. So, the negative self-talk that you're going to have, it's all based on how you perceive it. And let's say the consequences of the bully, pretty much nothing. They may get detention or whatever. They may get trouble. Their parents may get notified. They just say, don't do it again. But we all know that it's going to happen again. It doesn't necessarily do anything. And we don't know the backstory of the bully. That's a huge thing. We just say, like, stop messing with this person. But we never really ask, like, why the person does it or what's going on in their life. No one really asks that. So the bully's just like, I'll just keep doing it again. So what can schools do about bullying? Again, so I've answered that one. Helping people become more, helping children not necessarily view the words or the things that are happening to them as negative. Once they hear those negative things, provide them with positivity. And so they know who they truly are. We all have negative and positives about us, but we don't want to stick so much to the negative. We want that. It's pretty much a balance. What can parents do about bullying? So the same thing about schools, So let's say like someone comes home. I'm pretty sure like we've all seen like those like clips. Those like bullying clips on like YouTube or whatnot. Where like the kid's always sad. The parents don't really like pay attention to it. Or they're just like, how a school they weren't feeling well and they kind of just pass it off. Like a lot of parents think it's just a phase, they'll get over it. Same thing happened to me when I was younger. You'll get through it, or whatever that means. But how does peer pressure impact bullying behavior? So this could be positive or negative. You could have peer influence saying, oh, you shouldn't mess with this person, you shouldn't mess with this person. And, in school, you don't want to necessarily disagree with that because those people just leave you, right? And you kind of want people to be around. You want to have that group. So you'll go along with it. And on the other hand, you may have a group of people that say, oh, you shouldn't do this. And it may make you listen. So, like, if you do this negative thing, they are not going to be friends with you. But if you do this positive thing with them, you guys could, like, mesh together. So it's a positive and negative relationship. It depends on what kind of pressuring they're providing to you. So, how long does it take for someone to fully heal from the trauma of bullying, and on average? So that's a pretty loaded question. I would say that there's not necessarily a specific time frame. For some people, it could take a lifetime. For some people, they could get over it very quickly. Again, it depends on how you perceived those things that were said to you, right? It depends on what was said to you, how you dealt with it during that time, and how you're dealing with it now. So there's many different variables, and it's not necessarily you can find an average of that. It pretty much varies from, let's say, the day it happened to the rest of your life. Some people get through it faster than other people. But if it's like trauma, right? So with trauma, there's going to be certain things that trigger you. Say someone says a word that you may have heard way back then, and it causes that reaction to you. You're like, oh, all those memories come back. So you could say, let's say you could truly have healed from that experience, but once one of those triggers comes back to you, it's like you're starting all over again. So you could have had many times where you've gotten fully like dealt with it, but then something happened that made it come back, and now you're dealing with it again, and then it goes away, and then it comes back. So you'd have to pinpoint those things that trigger you and find a way to truly tackle them on and deal with it, and know that these things aren't necessarily true, that you're not these things, and that you're better than that, and that you can get through it. So it's not necessarily a time frame for that. And the last question. I bully myself through negative self-talk. Why do I do this, and how do I make it stay? So basically, how do you make it the negative self-talk go away? So why do you do this? Most likely you've heard a bully do this to you, and then you started to believe those words and internalized it to yourself. You started to believe these things, and now you say it over and over again to further validate those negative words that you've been saying. So that's essentially why you do that. You believe those things that were said to you as true. And it could be like direct or indirect. Someone can actually say it to you, or someone can have an action that makes you believe that you are those things. So, for example, someone can say you're boring. That would be direct. Let's say you're with a group of people and they're not necessarily paying attention to when you're talking. That would be indirect. You could believe that you're boring in both scenarios. So it's all based on your perception of who you are. So you would perceive yourself as a negative person instead of a positive person. Or like you perceive yourself as having more negatives than positives. So you gravitate towards those negatives. And to get through that, essentially what I said before with the positives and negatives, you'd have to truly dive in and look at yourself as an individual. See who you are as a person. Like all your positives and all your negatives. And see who you are as a person. Learn to enjoy who you are as a person. Start to accept some of the flaws that you may have. Because again, we're not perfect. We all have flaws. So just accepting those things. And taking it one step at a time. So don't necessarily tackle each negative characteristic or word about you. Just taking them one step at a time and saying, why do I necessarily believe these things? Why is this thing affecting me? Just a bunch of questions to ask yourself and to truly learn who you are. Start to spend time by yourself, to love yourself and whatnot. It's a lifelong process, but it's something that never ends. So you're always constantly doing this. It's like progression each day. So it's going to take a long time for that negative cycle to get away. And it pretty much lasts a lifetime. We each have those moments where we get to that negative slump or that cycle. But the people that truly know themselves more get through it faster because they know like, hey, I'm not like this. I need to get through it and get back to what I was doing. So it just depends on how you identify yourself. How do you feel about yourself? Do you love yourself? Do you hate yourself? And just truly knowing who you are as a person. That's basically it. So that's the end of the questions. That's essentially the end of this episode. This 10th episode. Pretty long episode, to be honest. Over an hour. But we talked about a lot of things. Grasping the whole thing of bullying. So is it possible to stop it? Not necessarily. We all do it. We all may not even know that we do it, but it happens. And it's not just based on school-age children. It happens way more through adulthood. Probably happens daily. It's just we don't necessarily perceive it as bullying anymore when we're older. So yes. Last thing before we end this, make sure to check out my website, mentalhealthtruth.net. You can find articles on counseling, mental health therapy. You can also check out my book, The Lost Art of Human Life and Motivation, with also some apparel, if you are into that sort of thing with apparel. I have a few designs on there, so you could check it out. I will definitely leave the website in the description, but most likely if you are listening to this, you are already on my website. So be sure to check out the other links that I will leave in the description. And yeah, that's pretty much it. Let me know if you have any suggestions, any questions, or any comments of what you thought about this heavy loaded topic. So yeah, that's it for today. Truth signing out. Goodbye, everybody.